Okay, let's dive into a really fascinating period, how Soviet Russia um, navigated the incredibly complex world of international diplomacy right after the 1917 revolution.
Yeah, it's a critical moment. We're looking at sources covering the peace treaties, trade deals, strategic moves, basically how the new state tried to find its footing.
Right, because they start out the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, the RSFSR, and they are just completely isolated, aren't they?
Oh, deeply. The capitalist states were hostile. I mean, not just because of the revolutionary ideology, which is obviously a huge factor, but also, the Bolsheviks just canceled all the old czarist debts.
Which didn't exactly win them friends in international finance.
Not at all. So you've got this inherent conflict, a state dedicated in theory to overthrowing the capitalist world order.
Yeah.
But it's caught in a brutal civil war, the economy's collapsing, and it desperately needs to engage with that same capitalist system just to survive.
That tension is key, isn't it? Revolutionary ideals hitting the wall of, well, reality, geopolitics, economics.
Exactly. And it forces this surprisingly pragmatic foreign policy right from the start.
And it's important to understand, as the sources point out, that getting recognition wasn't like flipping a switch. It wasn't one single event.
No, definitely not. It was a spectrum. You had things like de facto recognition, often just through trade agreements,
Right.
all the way to full, formal, de jure diplomatic relations. It was a process.
A gradual, maybe even reluctant path driven by sheer necessity.
Pretty much.
So our mission here is to unpack the key moments from these sources. We want to help you understand not just what happened, which treaties, when recognition occurred, but why. What were the strategies? How did leaders, especially Lenin, balance those big revolutionary ideas with the immediate need to, well, keep the state alive?
Let's trace that journey from those first really painful compromises to eventually breaking the blockades and finding some unlikely partners along the way.
Okay, where do we start? It has to be with making peace, right? In a world that was still largely at war or deeply hostile.
Absolutely. And the first major step was forced. A brutal peace, really. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, March 3rd, 1918.
With the Central Powers Germany, Austria, Hungary.
Right. And you have to remember the context. Lenin's decree on peace came almost immediately after the revolution, October 1917. They wanted out of World War I. Negotiations actually started pretty quickly by December 17.
But the terms Germany and its allies demanded were staggering.
Oh, incredibly harsh. Russia had to give up vast territories. Finland, the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, parts of Poland, Ukraine.
We're talking huge losses of population, farmland, industry.
Absolutely vital resources. It effectively took Russia completely out of World War I.
Lenin himself called it a chasm of defeat, humiliation. How did he justify signing something so devastating?
Well, he defended it fiercely. His argument was that it was a necessary sacrifice, a sacrifice needed for the preservation of the revolution.
So the survival of the revolutionary state trumped everything else, even national territory.
For him, yes. He viewed World War I as an imperialist conflict, just capitalists fighting capitalists. He believed the new worker state had no business being involved.
And there was that idea of revolutionary defeatism, too, right? That maybe Russia losing could spark revolutions elsewhere.
Exactly. He saw the treaty partly as buying time, a strategic retreat. He was gambling, really, that revolutions would break out in Germany and the West, and maybe those revolutions would overturn the treaty's terms later.
A massive gamble, a temporary concession for a hoped-for future gain.
A huge one. But as it turned out, Germany lost the war later that year, in November 1918. So the treaty was annulled anyway.
Ah, okay. So they were freed from its worst aspects, but the whole question of borders, especially with the states emerging from the old Russian Empire, that remained a huge issue.
Precisely. Brest-Litovsk was void, the Civil War was raging or winding down. Securing the actual borders of the new Soviet state became the next critical priority. This led to a series of peace treaties, mostly in 1920 and 1921, with these newly independent neighbors.
And these treaties weren't just about ending fighting. They were often the very first instances of other countries formally recognizing the Soviet government.
Right. Especially crucial were the treaties with the Baltic states and Finland. Let's look at the Treaty of Tartu with Estonia, February 2nd, 1920. It's really revealing.
Okay, so it fixed the border, ended the Estonian War of Independence. But the terms seem surprisingly generous to Estonia. They got territory that wasn't strictly Estonian ethnically, east of the Narva River, south of Lake Skov.
They did. It was a significant concession from the Soviet side. They also agreed to pay Estonia 15 million gold rubles, return cultural artifacts, grant economic advantages.
Why give up so much?
Well, there were security clauses too, temporary demilitarization near the border, and crucially, Article 7, which basically said neither side could allow hostile forces or groups claiming to be the other's government on their territory.
Ah, so it was about preventing Estonia from becoming a base for anti-Bolshevik forces, like the White Armies or foreign interventionists.
Exactly. Pay a price, concede some land to secure that border and neutralize a potential threat. The Soviet negotiator, Ioffe, apparently even called the new border aggressive, meaning it potentially favored Estonia militarily. It was a calculated cost.
And this is where survival really comes into focus. Your sources stress the importance of the Estonian port of Tallinn, or Revel as it was often called then.
The Revel Corridor. Absolutely critical. During the horrific famine of 1921-22, estimates are up to 5.2 million people died. This port was a lifeline.
How so?
The Tartu Treaty essentially secured Tallinn as a friendly Porto Franco, a free port. It allowed Soviet Russia to ship out things like confiscated gold, jewels, art nationalized valuables, often selling them at big discounts because they were desperate.
To pay for essential imports coming in through that same port, like grain.
Exactly. American wheat, machinery, things needed to literally keep people alive and the economy from completely collapsing.
Wow. So the treaty wasn't just lines on a map. It was about access. Access to the outside world for trade, for aid. The sources call it a very expensive price, but it sounds like it was deemed essential.
It really was. It secured the port, removed a military threat near Petrograd, and, crucially, helped break the Allied economic blockade. This wasn't weakness, this was Lenin's pragmatism. He apparently saw it as a window broken through to Western Europe, even a kind of victory.
A victory in giving up land and gold.
A victory in securing the state's survival and turning focus inward. He reportedly felt they shouldn't shed blood for a piece of land, believing these borders were temporary anyway, that future socialist revolutions would change everything. It reflects that revolutionary expediency idea, practical needs over legal norms or territory, for now.
Okay, so Estonia was first. What about the other neighbors?
It's a similar pattern. Lithuania signed the Moscow Treaty on July 12, 1920, recognition of independence.
And Latvia?
The Riga Peace Treaty, August 11, 1920. The language there is strong. Russia unconditionally recognizes the independence and sovereignty, and voluntarily and forever renounces all sovereign rights.
That sounds pretty definitive.
It was meant to be. Then Finland, October 14, 1920, another peace treaty, another early recognition.
So those four, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Finland, were the key ones in 1920. The strategy seems clear. Lock down the western borders, create a buffer, stop those states being used against them, and shift from promoting immediate world revolution to consolidating the Soviet state itself.
Precisely. And unlike Brest-Litovsk, these treaties explicitly involved recognition of the RSFSR.
What about further afield, eastward, southward?
Yes, in 1921 you see efforts to build ties there too, often playing on anti-imperialist feelings. There was a friendship treaty with Afghanistan on February 28th. Soviet Russia was actually the first country to recognize Afghanistan after its war with Britain.
Interesting. And Persia, Iran?
A treaty on February 26, 1921. Annulled old Tsarist deals, granted equal shipping rights in the Caspian Sea, quite significant for both.
And Turkey.
The Moscow Treaty, March 16, 1921, with the new Turkish nationalist government under Ataturk. This was followed by the Kars Treaty later that year, settling borders with the Soviet republics in the Caucasus. So a clear effort to stabilize borders and build relationships beyond Europe.
Okay, so by 1921, 1922, the focus seems to shift again. Less about immediate neighbors, more about breaking that wider economic isolation and getting recognition from the major capitalist powers. Trade becomes even more central.
Absolutely. And the big breakthrough here is the Anglo-Soviet Trade Agreement, signed March 16, 1921.
Britain. That seems like a big deal, the first major capitalist power.
It was huge. It facilitated trade, yes, but crucially, it effectively ended the British naval blockade, opened Russian ports to British ships. They even agreed to tone down hostile propaganda against each other.
So not full diplomatic relations yet, but...
But definitely de facto recognition, a massive step onto the world stage. It wasn't easy, though. Negotiations dragged on, partly because of the ongoing Polish-Soviet War, and there was strong opposition in Britain from people like Churchill.
And again, that need for trade, that Revel quarter factor during the famine, must have been pushing hard for this deal, exporting valuables to import necessities.
Undeniably. Economic desperation was a powerful motivator. And that same dynamic economic need-trumping ideology leads us straight to the Treaty of Rapallo, April 16, 1922.
Rapallo? With Germany? This always struck me as a key moment. Two outcasts finding common ground.
That's exactly how it's often framed, a natural alliance of pariahs. Germany was isolated by the Versailles Treaty after World War I, feeling punished and resentful. Russia was the revolutionary outcast.
So what did Rapallo do?
It was momentous. Germany granted full political de jure recognition to the RSFSR. They established full diplomatic relations, agreed on extensive economic cooperation, and crucially, both sides renounced all war-related financial claims against each other, including reparations and debts stemming from Brest-Litovsk.
Wiping the slate clean, financially at least.
Yes, and the agreement was later extended to the other Soviet republics that would soon form the USSR, Ukraine, Belarus, the Transcaucasian republics.
So Rapallo's significance.
It definitively ended Soviet Russia's diplomatic isolation among the major European powers. It was their first full treaty establishing de jure recognition with a major state, a massive diplomatic coup.
And like the British deal, driven largely by economics, Russia needing German industry and capital, Germany needing Russian markets and resources.
Very much so. Restarting battered economies was paramount on both sides. But Rapallo also perfectly illustrates Lenin's thinking about exploiting divisions within the capitalist world.
His theory of imperialism, that capitalist states would inevitably compete and clash.
Exactly. He saw World War I as proof. He believed the Soviets could use these inter-imperialist contradictions to their advantage. Making a deal with Germany, another power feeling sidelined by Britain and France, was a classic example. He even talked about seeking an alliance with all countries living under the Treaty of Versailles, use their grievances to break Soviet isolation.
Clever maneuvering. Okay, so these trade deals and Rapallo laid the groundwork. What about wider acceptance, full de jure recognition from more countries?
That really picks up steam around 1924. And remember, by then, the USSR, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, had been formally created December 30th, 1922. So subsequent recognitions were technically of the USSR.
Right, and the UK comes back into the picture.
Yes. Having granted de facto recognition with the trade deal in 21, the UK grants full de jure recognition on February 1st, 1924. A Labour government under Ramsay MacDonald made the move. Hugely significant given Britain's global influence.
And Italy.
Italy had also done a trade deal giving de facto recognition in late 1921. They followed up with full de jure recognition between February 7th and 11th, 1924. It's quite striking. Fascist Italy under Mussolini was one of the first Western powers to grant full recognition.
Pragmatism over ideology again, perhaps?
Seems likely on both sides. Then the Nordics joined in. Norway, February 15th, 1924. That deal also included sorting out sovereignty over Svalbard.
Ah, right. And Denmark.
Denmark followed on June 18th, 1924.
What about further east?
China signed an agreement on May 31st, 1924. It wasn't quite Western-style diplomatic recognition, but it dealt with joint administration of the crucial Chinese Eastern Railway. So, significant state-to-state engagement.
But the big holdout, the real contrast, is the United States.
Absolutely. Despite Americans providing crucial famine relief in the early 20s, despite U.S. businesses starting to engage under Lenin's new economic policy, the NEP.
Which allowed some private enterprise.
Right. Despite all that, the U.S. government refused formal diplomatic relations all the way until 1933.
A full decade after others were normalizing ties. Why the long delay?
Deep ideological mistrust. The unresolved issue of those repudiated Tsarist debts was a factor too, and ongoing American fears about Soviet support for world revolution, the Comintern's activities.
So it really shows how profound ideological divides could prevent normalization, even when pragmatic reasons for engagement existed. It certainly shaped the whole future of U.S.-Soviet relations.
It really did. It set a tone of suspicion early on. But back in Europe, you see this kind of domino effect in 1924. Once Britain and Germany had normalized relations, even if Britain's was initially de facto.
It made it easier for others, lowered the political risk.
Exactly. That cluster of recognitions, UK, Italy, Norway, Denmark, all happening within a few months, suggests that the actions of major powers influenced the calculations of smaller states. International relations aren't just isolated bilateral deals.
Okay, stepping back, it's impossible to talk about this period without focusing on Lenin's role, his thinking. It seems like a constant tightrope walk.
It really was a complex interplay between his Marxist-Leninist ideology and just raw, pragmatic necessity.
He started out hoping for world revolution to spread quickly from Russia, right?
Yes, the initial belief was that the Russian Revolution was just the spark, that Germany, maybe others in Europe, would follow very soon. When those revolutions failed to materialize or were crushed, the focus had to shift.
To survival, to consolidating the one socialist state they actually had.
Precisely. Protecting the Soviet state became the priority, seeing it as the base, the fortress from which future world revolution could eventually be supported. He still believed revolution would happen maybe in the weakest link of capitalism, as he saw Russia, but protecting that link came first.
Which explains how he could stomach Brest-Litovsk, calling it that humiliation but necessary, or push for the NEP, bringing back elements of capitalism.
Exactly. Short-term compromises, even ideologically difficult ones, were justified if they served the long-term strategic goal, preserving the Soviet state. That's the essence of his revolutionary pragmatism.
And trade with capitalists fits that mold too.
Absolutely. He saw it as absolutely essential for economic recovery, especially under NEP. He was willing to bargain, find the best terms, but he viewed these purely as commercial arrangements. The ideological opposition remained.
He even saw it as proof that capitalists needed Soviet markets and resources to avoid their own collapse, didn't he?
Yes, turning the tables ideologically. And as we saw with Rapallo, he was constantly looking for ways to exploit those inter-imperialist contradictions, the rivalries between capitalist powers, use their conflicts to Soviet advantage.
So diplomacy, treaties, trade deals, they were all tools, means to an end.
Primarily, yes. The ends were survival, breaking isolation, economic recovery, ultimately protecting the base for future revolution. It wasn't really about building genuine, lasting cooperation based on shared values with capitalist states. That underlying suspicion remained.
It really sets a pattern. Okay, let's quickly recap that initial wave, maybe the first 10 recognitions chronologically, just to crystallize the sequence.
Sure. So number 1, Estonia, February 1920. De jure, via the Tartu Peace Treaty. Critical first step, the border security. The Revel Corridor.
2, Lithuania, July 1920. De jure, Moscow Treaty.
3, Latvia, August 1920. De jure, Riga Peace Treaty, strong renunciation of claims.
4, Finland, October 1920. De jure, Peace Treaty, locking down that northern border.
5, Persia, Iran, February 1921. De jure, Friendship Treaty. Looking south.
6, Afghanistan, February 1921. De jure, Friendship Treaty. First relations after their war with Britain.
7, Turkey, March 1921. De jure, Moscow Treaty, building ties with the new nationalist government.
8, the United Kingdom, March 1921. Crucially, de facto recognition via the trade agreement, ending the blockade.
9, Italy, December 1921. Also de facto via a trade deal. First Western country to take that step.
And finally, 10, Germany, April 1922. De jure, political recognition via the Treaty of Rapallo, ending major power isolation.
That sequence really shows the progression. First, the immediate neighbors for survival and consolidation, then reaching out to the east, then the crucial breakthroughs with major European powers driven by trade, culminating in Rapallo.
It's a journey from near total isolation to a reluctant, often calculating engagement, driven by necessity and Lenin's pragmatic adaptation of ideology.
These early relationships, however strained or tactical they might have been, were foundational. They allowed the USSR to survive, to emerge onto the world stage, and really shaped global politics for the rest of the century.
A really powerful example of how ideology and harsh reality collide in international affairs.
Definitely. How extreme circumstances force adaptation, even for revolutionary states.
So, something for you, the listener, to think about. How much did this early period, this balancing act between revolutionary ideals and pragmatic survival, set the template for Soviet foreign policy later on? Did this pattern of seeking advantage through division, of tactical compromise while holding on to long-term goals continue? Or maybe there's a more universal point here. Does the sheer need for any state to survive sometimes force compromises that seem to betray its founding principles, whether it's Soviet Russia or any other nation facing existential threats? What really stands out to you about this journey from pariah state to reluctant player on the world stage?